more than ever. This is Sekulow.
The opinion just handed down a moment ago, a ruling on school choice and religious freedom that directly applied to a school in the state of Maine.
We want to hear from you. Share and post your comments or call 1-800-684-3110.
The court has just ruled that the program which banned those funds from going to religious schools actually violates the Constitution, meaning those vouchers can be used at private schools that have a religious core to them.
And now your host, Jordan Sekulow.
All right, welcome to Sekulow, and we'll take your phone calls. So if you've got questions and comments about this at 1-800-684-3110. We have done a lot of work on school choice at the American Center for Law and Justice. And one of the big barriers to school choice that's been in the states for decades has been this issue of if we have a school choice program that allows parents to decide to send their kids, whether it's a voucher or tax credit, to a private school, can it also go to a private religious school? Going so far as to say, can it go to a private religious school? But what about the religious class and issues like that? Well, the Supreme Court has really clarified now for the third time, over a series of cases. This one originated out of Maine. And again, this is Carson versus Makin, 6-3 out of the U.S. Supreme Court. The opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. And it says very clearly, if you are going to have programs that allow parents to choose to send, that you use the money to send their children to a private school, you cannot exclude religious schools from that parental choice. So a huge win because it opens the door, not just in Maine, but again clarifies from the Supreme Court. This is the second time in just a few years the Supreme Court has again clarified that when you do these programs, you can't exclude religious schools.
Well, what's interesting about this is Maine had a situation where they did not have secondary schools in a lot of the rural communities, which is a large part of Maine. So what they did was they gave an option of tuition assistance, but they said the school had to be non-sectarian. And as you said, Jordan, 6 justices of the Supreme Court said that violates. What's interesting here is the free exercise clause. It's one a speech case. It wasn't an establishment clause case. It was the right to free exercise of religion. And the court said, as we've explained in other opinions, interest in separating church and state more fiercely than the federal Constitution cannot qualify as compelling in the face of an infringement of free exercise. So this case elevated the free exercise clause of the Constitution. That's good. It also says that you cannot target religious institutions for exclusion from otherwise available programs. It noted that the state need not subsidize private education, and nothing requires a state to provide for subsidies for private schools. But once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious. Now, we've been arguing that for a long time. There was a case I had, Locke versus Davey, where the court ruled against us. That case has now been severely narrowed, almost narrowed out of existence, basically overturned in the way that they're now interpreting it. So what you've got is a big win for parents, and this has been a big issue for us, in parental choice and education.
Yeah, this is, again, it'll make sure that when states are crafting school choice laws, they have great, now solid Supreme Court precedent about making sure that they can include the full plenty of schools. And again, remember, none of this is states saying, we're going to send money to Christian schools, we're going to decide to do that. The parent makes the initial choice. I think that's very important here. That's why it's about the free exercise clause, the violation of the free exercise. This is about the parental choice. No one forces states to have school choice programs. We certainly support them at the ACLJ. In Maine, it was a necessity because there were just not enough schools in some of these rural areas that were close by, and yet they still were trying to exclude parents from being able to make the choice to send their kids to religious schools when that may have been the school that was the closest school to them, that had the least amount of travel time. It made the most sense. And the Supreme Court 6-3 said no. Now, the liberal justices, they're not happy about this. We get back to the break. We hear some of their absurd statements, but they just don't love the fact that the free exercise clause in the First Amendment is meaning something again at the U.S. Supreme Court. We'll take your phone calls, your comments, 1-800-684-3110.
We do have have a decision in a case we've been watching carefully from the U.S. Supreme Court. The opinion just handed down a moment ago, a ruling on school choice and religious freedom that directly applied to a school in the state of Maine.
Carson versus Makin involves school choice in the state of Maine, which is tied to state-funded tuition aid in settings where public schools are not available.
In this case, the justices are being asked whether taxpayer money may go to schools providing religious instruction.
They are seeking equal treatment, not special treatment. They're saying, don't treat me worse because I want to send my children to a religious school rather than a secular school. Treat me the same as the secular parent.
These are principles that we think our students should keep in mind, consistent with the religious outlook of our community. Would that school be disqualified?
I think what the defining feature or what would make the difference is whether children are being taught that your religion demands that you do these things, that your religion
Then
demands.
you really are discriminating on the basis of religious belief.
We're getting to a more constitutional understanding of the First Amendment.
The court has just ruled that the program which banned those funds from going to religious schools actually violates the Constitution, meaning those vouchers can be used at private schools that have a religious core to them.
What the court basically said today is people can't be penalized and have a benefit that's otherwise available to people unavailable to them because of their religious beliefs, because that's a violation of a liberty that existed before the Constitution did.
This is a big win for school choice advocates who have wanted money to follow students rather than go straight to school districts. It doesn't go that far, but it does say potentially open the door to that kind of conversation, saying that this Maine program, which said you can't use the school vouchers at religious schools, that violates the Constitution, Bill.
All right, welcome back to Sekulow. So again, in a big victory, some will say it's a religious liberty victory. Some will say it's really a victory for school choice, because ultimately it's about parents deciding where they want to send their kids to go. So we know that these programs are popping up all over the country. Some states have had them for a long time. Other states are just starting to tinker with how to set them up. But what they're always looking to is not having a constitutional crisis by setting up these school choice programs. So the Supreme Court has again clarified for the second time in 2 years, first we saw it out of Montana, now Maine, that if you set up these school choice programs, you cannot exclude religious schools from the schools that parents can choose from.
Right.
Remember, it's not just saying we're going to fund religious schools. It's saying the parents that get the voucher, that get the tax credit from the government, for whatever reason the state has decided to set up a school choice program, then you cannot exclude religious schools, or it violates the U.S. Constitution and specifically the free exercise of religion, which we have seen over time for many decades meant very little to the Supreme Court, unfortunately. They would overlook that part of the Constitution and kind of go to other provisions of the Constitution. But for the last 3-4 years, we saw this new life being breathed into that, to the point where, listen, the liberal justices are taking notice. In Justice Sotomayor's dissent, she wrote in 2017. Now, in 2017, I want you to understand what she's talking about here. With all the serious issues we deal with as a country and that the Supreme Court deals with, it was a playground case, a playground reimbursement program to make playgrounds safer in the state of Missouri. So one of these, of course, was a church playground. And she wrote in 2017, I feared that the court was leading us to a place where separation of church and state is a constitutional slogan, not a constitutional commitment. Today, the court leads us to a place where separation of church and state becomes a constitutional violation. So you see the anger there. I like to put into context that her anger started because she didn't want the church playground to be at the same level as a public school playground.
Safety-wise.
Which you think the kid playing on the playground or who falls on the playground cares about the doctrine at that point of their age of where they fell? Or you think their parents will really, of where it's safe? But that's where it starts with them. That's how insane they are on these issues, and their commitment to the idea of separation of church and state over actual constitutional protections like the free exercise of religion.
So the court said, we have repeatedly held that a state violates the free exercise clause when it excludes religious observers from otherwise available public benefits. Harry, that does not sound like a difficult concept to grasp, but yet the Supreme Court, I've been litigating this issue for 4 decades. I think they got it right now, and we're getting in the right framework, but you cannot penalize the religious schools simply because they have a sectarian base.
I think you're precisely correct, and I think the progressives on the United States Supreme Court are precisely wrong. They fail to understand that this particular decision issued by the United States Supreme Court arguably advances religious freedom. Why? Because the money follows the neutral or independent choice of the parents. It is this program, at least as amended by the United States Supreme Court, does not advance religion. But the progressives fail to understand that. So if you look at Justice Breyer's dissent, he argues that this particular decision advances religious strife. He is completely wrong. He's got it backwards. It advances the concept of neutrality as opposed to religious strife. And I think at the end of the day, the American people will agree with it.
Their version of neutrality, though, the dissent, and this has been consistent with the left side of the court, their view of neutrality is exclude religious participants. That's how they don't view neutral as we'll treat everybody the same, neutral. They believe neutral is you disqualify the religious advocate. This way, the government is neutral as to religion. But here's what the Chief Justice has opinion issued by John Roberts, signed by all 5 of the conservative justices. While a state need not subsidize private education, in other words, you can't compel a state to subsidize private education, once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious. In other words, the Free Exercise Clause does not allow a burden to be placed on the religious participant simply because they are religious. And that's important to point out.
Yeah, and again, this is just, it's up to the parents here. As like Harry was talking about, this is not the state saying we're going to favor religious schools, or the idea is to really think about it like this way. Why is it okay for the non-sectarian private schools to get the money? I mean, this is an idea is that the left doesn't like school choice, and anything that could be a barrier to school choice programs they support. This was a barrier. This idea that if we open this up, is it going to be some constitutional fight that we have to take all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court because in some areas the only choice that people are going to have is potentially religious schools, or they might want to choose religious schools, and so we just won't have a school choice program. But the Supreme Court is making it clear and clear. You hopefully don't have to have another constitutional crisis, whether it's striking down the Blaine amendments,
which they are now,
which they have been doing for a couple of years, which were anti-Catholic amendments put out in the 1800s. That started, and now we started to see really the opening of school choice. So while the left wants to make it, couch it in, oh, this is favoring religion, what this is doing is it's hurting teachers' unions.
Exactly right.
And the major teachers' unions groups, because people say, when they have the choice, they're going to choose probably not the public school. Let's put it that way. If they have a choice of some other schools, including private schools that might not be religious at all.
So the court also said by conditioning the availability of benefits in a manner that the state Maine's Constitution does, like the programs, and then it says in Trinity, which is a previous case, effectively this penalizes the free exercise of religion. So in other words, Harry, if you exclude the religious institution simply because it's sectarian, it meets all of the other accreditation requirements. The Northeast Association of Colleges and Schools, yes, checks that box. Has the significant curriculum that they needed, checks that box. But the fact that they were religiously affiliated meant an automatic disqualification. And my view is here, and I know you've written about this, I have too, is that kind of targeted discrimination is exactly what the Free Exercise Clause was designed to prevent.
You are precisely correct, Jay. Many progressives claim to support the non-discrimination principle, but in reality, they oppose the non-discrimination principle when it comes to either religious schools, religious institutions, or religious individuals. So I think at the end of the day, if you look at this particular decision by the United States Supreme Court, it upholds the principle of non-discrimination, which means that religious institutions, religious parents, they are treated the same as other individuals and groups. And I think at the end of the day, that is what neutrality means. But keep in mind that the progressives on the United States Supreme Court, they are not neutral. They oppose any form of religion within the public square. They assume that Christianity, on one hand, is a majority religion, but then they rightly point out that there are 100 different religions in the United States. So in reality, there is no majority religion in the United States, and so neutrality commands that we treat every single person equally within the meaning of the free exercise clause of the Constitution.
Jordan, what you pointed out that this is a parent's choice issue, which is totally correct. Here's what the court said. As noted, a neutral benefit program in which public funds flow to religious organizations through the independent choices, that would be the parents, of private benefit recipients does not offend the Establishment Clause. And the court goes on to say that they had in previous cases held that interest in separating church and state more fiercely than the federal Constitution cannot qualify as compelling in the face of an infringement of the Free Exercise Clause. So this idea that, well, they could argue the state Constitution gives more church-state separation, thus you could exclude religious groups. The Supreme Court finally, and by the way, I've been arguing this for 40 years, finally closes that hole and says, no. A state Constitution cannot be used. We had this in New York with a number of cases I litigated at the Supreme Court. A state constitution cannot be used to override the Free Exercise Clause, which, again, sounds basic, the Supremacy Clause, but it took this opinion for the court to get there.
Yeah, it said this is discrimination against religion, the Maine program, and very clear by the U.S. Supreme Court. I want to take Kelly's call very quickly in Arizona on line 1. Hey, Kelly.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I have a question. From my reading of the Constitution, I thought there was no such thing as separation of church and state. I thought the Constitution said the government shall not dictate what religion a person could keep. So whenever they keep saying separation of church and state, I do not read that in the Constitution. And if you'll answer that after I hang up.
It's not in the Constitution, the separation of church and state. The idea, though, judicially is certainly in our laws. And I think there's a good way of looking at it and an over the top way of looking at it, a bad way of looking at it. And for too many decades, it's been the bad way. The Supreme Court has used that to just keep religion and treat it totally separate from everyone else. And now it's moved to say, we're not going to establish the Church of the United States. But if you have a program like this, you can't exclude religious people or religious schools. Be right back on Sekulow.
When someone has a pregnancy test, they're not determining whether they have a fetus or not. They're determining whether they have a baby or not. And that's a very simple principle. If that baby is a baby and that child is a child, what are we doing as a culture to be able to help protect them? Now, the abortion industry will want to tell you that nothing's changed in America, and nothing could be farther from the truth. When you talk to a lot of younger Americans, especially, they see the technology. They see the very high-quality sonograms that are now. That's not tissue that's inside the womb. They can look inside the womb now and see uniquely this child that's smiling back at them from inside the womb. And so this basic American value that we have, that life is important, extends to life no matter how tall they are, no matter how young they are. So a young child that's very small has the same value as an adult.
A baby in the womb should be protected legally. Is the law protecting that child now? The answer to that is no. It's better than it was. It's not where it should be. Look, the unborn child should be entitled to the same rights as everyone else that is a citizen of the United States. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That life means the right to at least be born. And the problem is, and it's I think a really serious one, is they don't view life until that child's outside of the womb, yet they control the exit point of the womb because of their abortion procedures.
The more that we talk about the child, quite frankly, the more frustrating it is to the other side, because the last thing they want to talk about is the child. So we win when we talk about the basic value of we just want to stand up for the rights of children, not only to be born, but to be able to live a healthy, productive life.
I think that every single human being's life is worth preserving, is worth protecting.
We at the American Center for Law and Justice have been dedicated to the fight for life for over 3 decades. Whether it's at the District Court, the Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court of the United States, or in the halls of Congress. We are part of the fight. We want you to be there with us. Go to aclj.org right now, aclj.org.
All right, welcome back to Sekulow. Now, great victory out of the U.S. Supreme Court for school choice, for religious liberty. And again, if you got a question about it, you can continue to call in 1-800-684-3110. It's very clear from the Supreme Court in their decision today and the opinions written, the majority opinion written by Chief Justice Roberts. We've uncovered, this is a letter sent June 17th from Democrat members of Congress from both the Senate, Mark Warner, and the House as well. Pretty well-known Democrats on this letter to the CEO of Google. Let me read this to you, because if they can't get the FBI or DOJ to do it, they want the companies to do it themselves, enforce their ideology. They write this to the CEO of Google. We write today regarding disturbing new reports that Google has been directing users who search for abortion services toward anti-abortion, quote, fake clinics, also known as crisis pregnancy centers or pregnancy resource centers, without any disclaimer indicating these businesses do not provide abortions and seek to steer women away from certain health decisions. In the wake of the leaked Supreme Court decision that would overturn Roe v. Wade, we find these reports especially concerning and would appreciate your immediate attention to this matter. It goes on, directing women towards, quote, fake clinics that traffic in, this is their favorite word, misinformation and don't provide comprehensive health services is dangerous to women's health and undermines the integrity of Google's search results. Now, there's a couple things at play here. Google's a private company. Companies and these organizations pay to be listed higher up in a search result. You can pay Google when you do your ad program to say, if someone searches for this, I want to be, listed here. Or if they search for this from this state or from this city, put me here. That's just capitalism at play and freedom. But they are going to try to put this pressure on Google. Let me tell you, I don't feel good about where Google is on this.
Well, that's the problem. So Google, you got to make sure that they don't do what they are going to be by nature wanting to do, which is to stifle these crisis pregnancy centers. Let me make it clear. Pro-life crisis pregnancy centers for women are under attack. We have been litigating this for 3 decades. We've litigated multiple times at the Supreme Court. C.C. Howe's been involved in these for over 2 decades. We are fighting this aggressively. But this move, and again, what you said, Jordan, using the word misinformation about crisis pregnancy centers, you got to understand, on the state level, some states are trying to do the very same thing. Close them down, misinformation, not referring for an abortion. They'll say that. You have to put up on they tried this. You have to put up in your clinic where you can go get an abortion, compelled speech. We won that at the Supreme Court of the United States. But now you've got the Senate and the House trying to basically pressure Google, and unfortunately, like Jordan says, who knows what Google will do, to go after these clinics once again. So it's multiple avenues of attack here.
Right, and pro-abortionists always try to denigrate CPCs every chance they get. That's why they try to call them fake clinics. And I always think when they say that, okay, you want to talk about a fake clinic? Let's talk about Planned Parenthood. They're not planning any parenthood at Planned Parenthood, if you want to talk about fake clinics. These are clinics that help women, that provide resources for them throughout their pregnancy free of charge. They do good work, and they are at the forefront of this battle, saving babies' lives. And that is why pro-abortionists are after them on every level. You have Jane's Revenge that is targeting them physically with violence and vandalism and everything. But then you also have now Congress going after them, trying to not stop anybody from going to a crisis pregnancy center.
And then you have them under attack, being, where they're using fire bombings, vandalism, desecration, but actually blowing up the insides of these clinics. And where's the Department of Justice in this? Merrick Garland's over in Kyiv today talking about war crimes, which sounds high and mighty, but we got a few problems here in the United States you should be paying attention to, too. But nothing out of the Department of Justice on this. Zero. No, we can tell.
Not at all. And again, you've had over 60 attacks, 5 fire bombings, and the group that is responsible for this is putting out statements, Jane's Revenge, like CC said, and they're saying that the attacks will only increase in their intensity and will be worse. And so if you're predicting what is worse than firebombing at night, well, it's firebombing during the day when people are actually there. It's potentially harming people or even taking a life, the violent level. So when you again, it goes from one thing when you're spray painting. It's another step when it's arson. okay, when you're firebombing an institution, and when you're continuing to make those threats, that this is just the beginning. It's not the end. They're telling those crisis pregnancy centers, shut down, we're warning you, or else. And this is why I think the letter from the members of Congress is encouraging this kind of behavior. Yes. Because they call it, these pro-life pregnancy centers of misinformation, like they're somehow bad.
No, they say
they're
anti-abortion fake clinics.
They're fake, they're misinformation. And so what they're asking Google to do is, of course, say, if Google will not take action to prevent anti-abortion fake clinics from appearing in search results. So if you can't be a pro-life pregnancy center that exists in a Google search result. So they say, if you won't do that, at least do their second favorite, misinformation. Will Google add user-friendly disclaimers about those groups? Will they flag everything?
What steps will Google take to limit the appearance of anti-abortion fake clinics or so-called crisis pregnancy centers in Google search results, Google ads, and on Google Maps when users search for abortion clinic, abortion pill, or similar terms? Or like abortion, I guess. So they want the pro-life side censored out by the private owner of Google. That's what they're asking for.
Absolutely. And once again, it's because these crisis pregnancy centers are on the front lines, and they pose a huge threat to the bottom line. They save babies' lives. So people aren't going to Planned Parenthood to get the abortions. They actually give them information. It's not misinformation. When you go to Planned Parenthood, you get no information. They don't want you to have the information about the baby inside of you. And so you go to crisis pregnancy centers, you get the information, and they don't want that.
But this is all part of a very orchestrated attack on the pro-life movement. And it also emanates from the disclosure of the Supreme Court decision, the draft opinion in Dobbs, and now what you're seeing happen, and I believe this is part of an orchestrated plan, the harassment of the justices at their home, which Merrick Garland's done nothing about, the desecration and firebombing of crisis pregnancy center clinics, which the Justice Department, Merrick Garland, have done nothing about. And now the House and Senate putting pressure upon Google to stop these crisis pregnancy centers from even appearing in Google Maps. I mean, think about that for a moment. This is an orchestrated attempt.
Absolutely. After the Dobbs opinion was leaked, people saw the pro-abortionists saw the writing on the wall. Roe v. Wade was a bad decision. There is no constitutional right to abortion. That, again, does not mean that relieves it or sends it back to the states. But there is no constitutional right to abortion. And the left and the pro-abortionists are freaking out, and they're attacking every way that they can, the justices, the CPCs, in any manner that they can shut this down, they will. If they're not going to get the right decision out of the Supreme Court, they're going to take it directly to the states and to the crisis pregnancy centers that are saving these babies.
Yeah, so they're trying to use big tech to censor pro-life speech, to shut down the ability for pro-life pregnancy centers to advertise, which a lot of times you're paying. I bet in almost all those situations, those pro-life pregnancy centers are spending resources they have fundraised so that they can be in those advertising spots. Everyone realizes that through Google, that the things that come up, some they actually say are ads right off the top that people have paid for. Then others, again, are based off where people are clicking, what people, again, are paying for in these searches. But see, if they can't silence the speech legally as the government, they want these content platforms like Google to silence the speech for them. We can't allow that to happen in the United States of America. We have to stand up for speech, and that includes pro-life speech, even in the face of the threat of violence. Support the work of the ACLJ at aclj.org. Be right back.
In my time in service, both as the CI director and as Secretary of State, I watched the good work that the ACLJ was doing here in the States and all across the world.
The ACLJ's work at the UN overseas is incredibly important.
We have on our team policy experts. They're all engaged in foreign policy issues.
We actually try to go in and do something positive and actually affect change.
We had a series of cases primarily dealing with religious liberty.
Nations that had more religious freedom had better democracies.
We've taken the First Amendment, and that has been our cornerstone. It's to defend the rights of people of faith.
We not only hold our government accountable, but we hold other governments accountable.
You have to actually be committed to fighting it out, or else you'll never win.
Your support of the ACLJ
enables us to do all of this. Go to aclj.org today. That's aclj.org.
Keeping you informed and engaged. Now more than ever. This is Sekulow. And now your host, Jordan Sekulow.
Welcome back to Sek Hill. We're taking your phone calls to 1-800-684-3110. A couple of issues we've already hit. One is a big case out of the Supreme Court, yet again, the second time in 2 years, and a series really since 2017 of saying, if you're going to have these state funds available to schools, or it's going to be a school choice program or a voucher program, however the state sets it up, you cannot exclude religious schools. That is a violation of the U.S. Constitution. And that was clear in the opinion today. The case is Carson versus Makin, a 6-3 decision. And it says there's nothing neutral about this. Was out of Maine's program. The state pays tuition for certain students at private schools so long as the schools are not religious. That is discrimination against religion. So the idea that all schools are okay except for religious schools has fallen again at the U.S. Supreme Court. The second issue we talked about was this attack by members of Congress, Democrats, on pro-life pregnancy centers, sending a letter to Google's CEO, asking that CEO and Google to start implementing a shutdown, basically a silencing of those abilities for those pro-life pregnancy centers to advertise in Google search engines, and also to put disclaimers. And they, of course, while there's violence against these pregnancy centers occurring across the country, they use terms that are very nasty about them, calling them fake abortion clinics, misinformation. They use that, of course, their keyword there. But we do have a call coming in about the school choice case. Lou in Washington State on line 2. Hey, Lou.
Hi, thanks for what you do and taking my call. I'm so happy about the correct SCOTUS decision regarding school choice vouchers to include faith-based education. And I'm wondering if parents will be able to get funds back that they recently paid for their religious school that was refused illegally.
Well, Anya, it's interesting. It's a good question. So in Maine, the court now held that the parents should have been, could they apply for reimbursement? I think there's an argument that could be made that they were wrongfully denied a benefit. And depending on the statute of limitations, they probably can. Now, remember what this does not do. This doesn't compel a state to provide for private funding for personal funding for private education. It still doesn't require school choice, but it says if you have school choice, you can't target the religious program for exclusion.
And I think what it's doing is making it easier for states. Every one of these cases, and I'm not sure there's going to have to be another one. There might be different challenges, but this one's been so clear. But it's so that states that want to implement school choice programs have a clear roadmap in what's not going to be a federal violation, especially even if they have state laws too. Their state laws that might say they prevent it have now been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, so they can move forward in implementing a full-on school choice program that doesn't exclude any schools. It doesn't exclude private schools of whatever, they're sectarian or non-sectarian, whatever their religious beliefs may be. This has been going on at the Supreme Court, really relooking at this since 2017, a very similar case in 2020 out of Montana, and now we saw in Maine. And in Maine, it was really a situation where Maine had no choice. They did not have enough public schools in rural areas to service their constituents, so they could not abide by, but they have to actually, provide their citizens, taxpayers, by law. So they wanted to have the school choice program, but they wanted to exclude religious schools. So they included private schools. They didn't say pick even the public school of your choice or the charter school of your choice. They said everything, including private schools, unless they're religious. And that's what the Supreme Court said. No, that violates the free exercise of religion. That's unconstitutional. I think this matter is very settled. The left is angry about it, but it should be a green light then for your states, if you don't have school choice programs, to create those school choice programs.
Which means you've got to work with your legislatures to get those in place. But now there'll be no prohibition for religious faith-based institutions, secondary schools, elementary schools, kindergartens, from participating in these programs. So that is a great decision and a great outcome. And it limited a case that we had, Locke versus Davey, significantly, which was causing a problem. This case we argued 20 years ago. But they've really limited the scope of that, so that's all very good. Support the work of the ACLJ as well.
Yeah, that's right, aclj.org. And we've got a lot more to talk about today on the broadcast. We're about to get a live report from ACLJ Jerusalem. The Israeli government has fallen in the Knesset. They weren't able to put a coalition together, which means there will be another election in Israel. Could be a different prime minister. We're going to go to Jeff Balaban from our office in ACLJ Jerusalem, who's joining us in the next segment of the broadcast. You don't want to miss that. We'll be right back.
Israel will head to the polls for a fifth election in a little over 3 years.
The fragile coalition government has fallen, officially fallen, dissolving parliament, calling for new elections. This is less than a year after it was cobbled together.
The government was the most diversified in Israel's history, uniting 8 parties, not only from the left and right, but for the first time, including an Arab Islamist party.
This is an evening of great news for the citizens of Israel. After a determined struggle of the opposition in the Knesset and great suffering of the public in Israel, it is clear to everyone that the most failing government in the history of the country has ended its way.
When you have 61 who all were pulling in different directions, that made it harder.
The idea that it ultimately fell apart is not something that should be a surprise to any of us. The fact that it took 10, 11, 12 months for it to fall apart, that I think is the surprise.
The Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, has reached an agreement with his Foreign Minister, Yair Lapid, as negotiations to save the shaky coalition government hit deadlock.
Yair Lapid, he is a centrist liberal. He will become the interim Prime Minister of Israel until those new elections happen.
Benjamin Netanyahu may have enough time to form his own coalition government within the current Knesset. If he's able to get, 2, 3, or 4 defectors to come over to the opposition, that would put him over the 60-61 threshold that he needs to form a government.
Defense Minister Benny Gantz tweeted, "Tonight, we are unfortunately closing a chapter on the government of change, a government who in a year of its activity has done a lot for Israeli society, its security, and its resilience, and will continue to operate during the transition period."
Even in this fragile political situation, you have to be careful and you have to be praying for the peace of Jerusalem, especially at this time.
Welcome back to Sekulow. To update you on some international news that we know you care about, and again, to get into some of the details there. In Israel, the coalition government has fallen inside the Israeli Knesset. So there is, what does that mean? Likely there's going to be another election in Israel, the 5th election in 3 years, which would determine the makeup of the Knesset, and that then determines the makeup of who is ultimately prime minister and who can put together a coalition. We have ACLJ Jerusalem, our office in Jerusalem. We're joined now by our senior counsel who runs that office, Jeff Balaban from Jerusalem. And Jeff, just right away, a reaction. This was a coalition that was from the beginning. People are even surprised that it lasted a year because it went from, for the first time, it had an Arab party as a member. It had some leftist parties as members, some very right-wing parties as members, and a fairly young prime minister. But it has now fallen.
Yes, it has fallen. And in fact, as you described, it was a very strange coalition. People did not believe it would last that long because it wasn't just that it had Arab parties in it and right-wing parties in it. Israel has a number of parties that has both Jews and Arabs in the party that are well integrated. In this case, we're talking about Arab parties that actually have supported Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. And to have right-wing figures like Naftali Bennett join with parties that are so extreme, people really didn't think it would last, and people were shocked. And what seems to happen now is that it's that governing coalition that pushed for this election because they know that it's collapsing. And it seems that they're trying to push to have this done quickly so that Bibi Netanyahu doesn't have a chance to pull together a new governing coalition.
Yeah, so because people need to understand, this is not Israel's system of government is not like the United. It's not a constitutional republic. So it's coalition governments, which is very similar to the UK system, and those could fall apart. Which, Andy, that's exactly what happened here. But it's not a constitutional republic.
No, it's not a constitutional republic, and it's not, for example, a two-party republic as is in the United States. It is more like the British system, but even more so because you've got multiple parties beyond just Tories and Labour and Scottish nationalists. You've got, as Jeff pointed out, multiple parties Bennett had put together a coalition of, I believe it was 8 ideologically diverse parties, and it seems that their ideological diverseness and diversity was being united by their dislike of Netanyahu.
Yes.
So that's what kept them together. Well, that's not a basis upon which to keep a government together.
Was the major, Jeff, and you're over there, obviously, run our office in Jerusalem. What was the major issue? I know there were security issues. I know there was economic issues that caused this coalition to fall apart, really, a year after it came together?
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. I think it's a combination. First of all, it's against the backdrop that we have in America also of a general malaise, a financial malaise. The economics aren't as good as they had hoped. Corona is back, and that's causing some issues, and that never helps the governing party. But the two major issues seems to be that it is, in fact, it has been for many years now, a referendum on Bibi Netanyahu. And the right wing, which some members of which, I guess, were chafing under Bibi's stronghold, thought maybe they could branch out on their own. But what they've done, it seems, many believe, is actually unite the right ideologically. The center right, who did not like this alternative, were very uncomfortable because of some of the parties that were involved. And so, again, it's really the governing coalition that's trying to push this as quickly as possible, because they sense that at this point, Bibi can now pull together a coalition of Israeli Zionist parties that are uncomfortable with what's been going on here for the past year.
Well, is what people predict? I mean, I know that you never know the outcome of how elections might come out or if a governing party, but is this what Israelis expect to happen? Because I know our audience here, they're very familiar with former Prime Minister Netanyahu. That they expect that this will usher in his return?
Most people I speak to, I would say, are hopeful. They were not happy with what's been happening until now, even though, as everyone is saying, they were surprised it lasted this long. What we'll notice, I think, is more security talk, and security isn't always negative. There's also the Abraham Accords, and Bibi can take credit for the Abraham Accords, and they continue to bring great benefit to this country. And we'll even see how this plays into President Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia. That will be interesting as well. But I think that people know that despite the internal political mechanisms that Andy was talking about and the personalities that tend to drive coalition politics, there is a view of Israel as a Jewish state that has been somewhat, if not abandoned, then damaged by the last year. And they would like to see that maybe reformed. So there is hope. The question is, do they have the time? Does Bibi have the time to assemble a coalition among all these fractious parties?
Yeah.
And that's going to see when this vote actually comes up. Will it be tomorrow?
Yeah, Jeff, you said that it's probably 4 or 5 coalition members that you could peel off that would form a majority for Likud to take the lead and to form a government. What is that time frame where he'd have to do that? And second part of that question is, has there been any indication that there's movement in that regard?
So unless something's happened in the last few minutes, which it may have, it was still up in the air whether this could happen as soon as tomorrow. And that's why the current governing coalition is the one who called for the election. Usually the opposition tries to topple a government. Here, it's the current governing coalition knowing that, sensing that they're probably on the way out and that Bibi, given a little more time, can pull together a coalition, is calling for it to happen as quickly as possible, and maybe as soon as tomorrow, but as quickly as possible, to deny Bibi that chance.
Jeff, I wanted to ask you, the fact that former Prime Minister Netanyahu is now under charges, being prosecuted for whatever allegations that stem from his tenure in office. Do you think that lessens his likelihood of being able to cobble something together before the elections, or do you think that just doesn't have an effect at all?
I would actually say it's the opposite. I would say that what most people are now satisfied is that it's what Bibi said all along, that there's no there to those charges. And actually, that's one of the factors that could be helping him now, that people feel like this was political and he did not get a fair shake and they don't like what was done to him. So even people who might have had a problem a year ago are more comfortable with Bibi now.
Yeah, but you would think, to me, and again, not Israeli, but Israelis are going to make their decision. But when you have an administration which is opening up, trying to reopen the Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem and taking those steps, again, taking a more anti-Israel position at international institutions, that you might want to bring in back a stronger leader not someone who's kind of was seen as a kid with a fragile coalition, but someone the world knows, the world deals with, including major world leaders. Because I think we saw too, Jeff, there was a misstep very early on by the current prime minister, and again, not judging there about him, but trying to be a broker between Russia and Ukraine as a country of 7 million, being really out front in that, and even that damaging some of Israel's credibility early on. And I think that probably Israelis want to move past that.
I think that's actually a fantastic point, and I think that's exactly right. In other words, the argument will be made, no doubt, by Bennett's side and others who would be in coalition with Bennett, the more left-wing parties, that you don't want to see a return to the kind of fractious existence between the Israeli government under Bibi Netanyahu and a democratic-run America. They don't want, everyone knows there was a lot of tension, more than tension, between Barack Obama as president and Bibi Netanyahu as prime minister. In fact, President Obama actually villainized Bibi very directly. And there's a sense that they'll argue that they don't want to see that again. We need America here in Israel. Well, the other sense is what you just said, Jordan. And I think that's more the overwhelming sense on the street that I've been hearing, and also among people in the know, that Israelis really don't want to hear that. They want a leader who's a true leader who will put Israel's interest first around the world. They know, they see, they feel the warm and productive peace that's happening in the Arab world with Israel, and they want to see more of that. And that really rests with Bibi, not with anyone else.
So, Jeff, if there is if Bibi cannot pull this coalition together in this interim period, when would the election be?
That's a great question. The system is complicated. There calls for multiple votes. And so it may take, let's say, 3 to 4 months till there's an election. And then, there's a period of time where they have to form a government. So everything hinges right now, well, I shouldn't say everything, Jay, but so much hinges right now how quickly the current government is able to push forward this vote. If they could actually get it to happen immediately, they're hoping it'll deny, and it's an outside chance, but they're hoping they'll deny Bibi the chance to put together a coalition. But the truth is, I haven't heard anyone able to think of a scenario where there's any coalition that's not Bibi's. So it's almost like two conflicting things. It's very hard to imagine him pulling it together right away. But there is a sense that the right-wing parties and the centrist parties are united. They don't like what they've had the last year. And so, listen, Bibi is best with his back against the wall, and people who are in the Bibi camp seem optimistic, and people who are in the Zionist camp tend to feel that they will, or the center-right camp, which is really most of the country is center-right, tend to feel that they will get, they're hopeful that Bibi will be able to pull it out.
Look, Benjamin Netanyahu has been a strong leader for Israel for a long, long time. He's made multiple comebacks. We work with him and in our defense of Israel at the International Criminal Court. We also saw then the Golan Heights Declaration that I had the privilege of being with Prime Minister Netanyahu when that was signed by President Trump. So some great developments. All right, Jeff, we appreciate it from Jerusalem. It's late at night there, not at our office today, but was earlier in the day. But again, folks, the ACLJ has an office operating in Jerusalem. Support the work, aclj.org.
Are you planning to sit down with oil and gas CEOs,
No.
Mr. President? Why is that, sir?
Because my team's going to do that. First of all, what they've done is they cut back on the refining capacity. All this stuff you hear about and you guys have to report, that Biden limited the amount of oil. They have 9,000 leases. 9,000 leases on public land. And they should either use it or lose it.
I don't think Mr. Biden's attack on refineries is suggested by the facts.
Well,
first to do is with the oil that's out there, we need them to refine that oil so that prices, so that the capacity could go up, and then prices would go down, inherently go down.
And so I know the president once said that he was going to end fossil fuel. Is that now off the table?
No, we are going to continue to move forward with our clean energy proposal.
The problem is what they've done is they've cut back on refining. And they say because they don't want to get caught in a position where eventually we're going to move to alternative energy, renewable energy, and they don't want to get stuck. Well, guess what? There's a logical transition to be made here. And I want an explanation from them as to why they aren't refining more oil.
I don't think that policies are responsible for what's happening in the oil market. what's happened is that production has gone down.
Unfortunately, we have a lot of these environmental regulations and incentives from the federal government have meant that about a third of the 11 refineries that have shut down because of those environmental regulations and because of incentives for them to switch from refining fuel to refining other feedstocks.
Pulling back to some domestic issues that everyone is facing on a daily basis here. We talked about a lot on this broadcast, but President Biden on the beach having to respond to a reporter's question directly about the oil prices, about inflation, about their commitment to the Green New Deal, because this administration has, on the one hand, said, they wrote the nasty grams to the oil companies, you're not refining enough oil. While at the same time, they said they are committed to ending the fossil fuel industry. So why would that industry spend more resources to bail out the Biden administration? And also, why would that be a good decision for their shareholders, a good economic decision? But here's President Biden. This is yesterday on the beach. Take a listen, because when we say that this is done intentionally to punish you, maybe it's gotten out of their control, but it was done intentionally. They wanted the prices to go up. They wanted this to happen. This was intentional policies that have just gone out of control. Take a listen to President Biden.
I'm working with our team is put together at the same time. My dear mother used to have an expression, if anything lousy, something good will happen if you look hard enough for it. Mm-hmm. We have a chance here to make a fundamental turn toward renewable energy, electric vehicles, and not just electric vehicles, but across the board.
So here's what's so disheartening about this, in my view, is number one, I agree with Jordan. Jordan said this earlier on our broadcast weeks ago, that this energy crisis was going to be utilized to make this pivot. Now, the problem is most people can't afford the $60,000 or $70,000 for an electric car. One. Two, there's not an electric power stations, enough of them, to keep people actually on the road. That's number two. Number three, they're screaming at the gas companies to produce more while they're telling them at the same time, we're putting you out of business in 2 to 5 years. So these inconsistent messages are the reason gas around the corner from here is $5.99 a gallon. So the mixed messaging here, Harry, is incredible, but they at least disclosed that they're going to use this crisis to make a pivotal turn.
I think that is precisely correct. So what the Biden administration is trying to do is to drive fossil fuel prices up higher and higher. They keep talking about, for instance, electric cars. They talk about wind power. They talk about solar power. All of those things are unreliable. Even electric powered cars are driven by what? Largely fossil fuels. So 70% of the electricity in the United States is generated by fossil fuels. And so I think at the end of the day, the Biden administration is doing nothing to boost international supplies of oil, wheat, fertilizer, and other crucial commodities depleted by all sorts of events in the world. He's doing nothing to increase the supply of goods and services from China, which has engaged in an economically damaging COVID-19 containment policy. So at the end of the day, Biden sees this as a moment of transformation, and the transformation will cost the American people more and more dollars, and it will threaten ultimately the employment of many Americans going forward.
You know, one of the things I said to watch out for and what's going on in Ukraine and Russia in that conflict is, and that, you know, and of course, Joe Biden blames the gas prices as Putin's increase. But there's a little news that came out over the weekend. It's not getting a lot of attention, but I think it's potentially very, very, very dangerous. And that is Russia has made threats against Lithuania, a NATO member, because of actions Lithuania has taken. Colonel Wes Smith is with us. because this all ties into the energy issue.
Yes.
What exactly has happened on this, and what did Lithuania allegedly do that's caused this reaction?
Yeah, what Lithuania has done is they have blocked all rail shipments that go through Lithuania going to Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is a territory claimed by Russia that has no border with Russia. It's on the Baltic Sea. And so it's important to Russia. They actually have nuclear.
Who controls that Kaliningrad? Is that controlled by Russia?
That's Russia, yes.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, their Baltic fleet, one of their big naval fleets, their headquarters is in Kaliningrad. They have nuclear-capable missiles in Kaliningrad. So they have depended for all these years on rail service getting supplies in and out. What Lithuania has done is they have gone along with EU sanctions. They didn't do this on their own. The EU sanctioned certain materials from being brought out of Russia, exported from there. It includes coal, metals, construction material, advanced technology. And so that's what Lithuania has done. Rail service with passengers and food still goes every day from Russia to Kaliningrad. So it's not a total blockade. And Lithuania has...
Lithuania have the legal right to do that?
Yes, I checked. And so they actually do. They're part of the European Union. And under that charter, whenever they pass legislation, every country is supposed to abide by it. They have no formal agreement on the rail service from Russia to Kaliningrad. And so they're simply going along with the EU sanctions.
Okay. Let me just ask the third natural question. So they had the legal right to do it, Lithuania.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They're a NATO member.
Right.
How dangerous of a move was it?
It's pretty brave because, as you and I both know...
Brave but dangerous?
Yes, it could be. I mean, in the past, as you and I have talked, in the 20th century... acts like this created wars.
Right.
You take this combined with Russia not letting any grain exports out of Ukraine, those two issues are strategically less important than what happened that started World War I.
So this is the problem, Jordan, with all of this, is that you got the situation with, you got Joe Biden saying, oh, you know, yeah, we've got this oil prices, gas prices are going through the roof. People better get used to electric cars. Harry rightly says we're not really ready for that. You've got the battle with Putin and Zelensky in Russia and Ukraine, and then Lithuania does something they have a right to do, to say no, we're not. We're gonna abide by the EU sanctions. But the cost of that in previous decades could have literally started a World War III.
Yeah, I mean, I think again this is something not getting enough attention because this is where again it's costing the U.S. a lot of money. The Biden administration is blaming everything on this, but what everyone would be most concerned about is that what would trigger potential more U.S. action or Western European action, including whether it's our troops, our pilots, our aircraft, all that, and the fact that there does not seem to be a resolution in sight at all about what's going on in Ukraine. And the idea that the Ukrainians were pushing back strongly against Russia, that is true, and that continues to be true, but Russia has succeeded in many ways. It just they don't succeed in the ways we usually define in the West because of the loss of life they've had, loss of troops. That's just how they fight. And so they will take a tremendous amount of losses, but they are still winning technically on the battlefield.
Jordan's right. You mentioned the situation with the lack of the ability to get grain out of Ukraine and other materials. This could have a devastating economic impact for the rest of the world.
Absolutely. So we are already experiencing grain and food shortages throughout the world. And it's important to reemphasize Jordan's point. Russia is actually winning this war, even though it's coming at a very, very high price. So as we drive up fossil fuel prices, guess what? We are fueling Russian success in Ukraine and the sanctions that we have imposed on Russia. They're backfiring. The cost of sanctions are being paid for by the American people.
All right, 30 seconds. Is Russia winning the war?
They are wearing Ukraine down, and yes, slowly they are winning the war. The jury's still out. Anything could happen, but they are wearing Ukraine down.
Folks, you know, the analysis we give you on this broadcast, as well as the ability for us to engage in these issues, is because of your support of the ACLJ. Now, today you've heard from our experts around this in the studio here. You've heard from our head of our office in Jerusalem. This happens because of your support of the ACLJ. Let me encourage you to do that at aclj.org. Also, we've set up a new 501c4 called ACLJ Action. Go to acljaction.org, $25 one time, and you're a member.